If you're about 60, you probably already started asking yourself this: can I stop working yet? Well, a couple called me recently with exactly that question. Sarah was 60, David had just turned 61, and a few days after his birthday, he'd had a health scare. I mean, thankfully, it was nothing serious, but it did change everything for them. He told me how he'd always assumed that they'd just keep on building their pensions and work until they're around 65, 66, and then enjoy a nice long retirement together. He told me that, sure, he didn't know how long they would live, but how the end had always felt like some distant, sort of blurry point in the future. But then for them, time became very real. And time is the one commodity that we just can't get back. They built up just over £500,000 for their retirement. David had about £320,000 in his pension, Sarah 100,000. They had a combined 60 grand in ISAs and about another 20 grand cash emergency buffer. So on paper, they'd done everything right. They were exactly the kind of people I bet a lot of you watching this probably recognize yourselves in. They told me how they were spending roughly £3,800 a month and they felt they were living well. They weren't extravagant, but they weren't scraping by either. Holidays, meals out, helping the kids occasionally, a normal, good life. And they asked me the simple question: if we retire now, can we keep living like this? So I did exactly what they asked. I built it properly in my cashflow software, and I had a feeling that it might not stack up, but I wanted them to see it in black and white first, and this is what came up. This was their £3,800 a month spending, increasing every year with inflation and using sensible long term growth assumptions. And this line represents their invested assets over time. You can see it falling sharply in those early years and only easing slightly once state pensions eventually come into the picture. And the money runs out in the late 70s. Pot simply can't sustain that lifestyle indefinitely. And that initial picture was a shock, and you could see the disappointment. But that wasn't the end of the conversation. That was the beginning. Because my job isn't to tell people what they can't do, it's to show them what's possible. And just to be clear, this is an illustration. It's not personal financial advice because your situation is going to be different. Different assets, different income sources, different priorities. That will change the detail and the percentages. But what doesn't change is the process that we go through to figure it out properly. So at this point, there were three main options, and I laid them out for David and Sarah. They could just keep working as they were for longer. They could cut back the hours and work part-time and ease their retirement, or there was a third option: revisit the target spending and see if it can be brought down. And this one could change everything. And it's all about being intentional and knowing your options properly. And the plan I just built was based on the spending guess that they told me. So I asked David and Sarah to do a little bit of homework, create a detailed line by line breakdown of where the money really goes today, and more importantly, how that would change in retirement. The process quickly unearthed huge expenses that would simply vanish the moment they stopped working. Things like £300 a month commuting for work, another £100 a month on work lunches and coffees. And with David in particular no longer commuting, it made sense to go from two cars to one, what was going to save thousands of pounds a year. They'd also forgotten that £3,800 a month figure included money that they were saving. It's about £200 each a month. And in retirement, that saving stops because you're now spending, you're not saving. But retirement isn't just about cutting back. It's about reallocating money to a life that you want. And spurred on by the health scare, they wanted to spend more on travel and hobbies. And after going through their process, this new realistic spending goal for them landed at £40,000 a year. This is almost £6,000 less than their first guess. But here's the key: this new budget actually allows for a better lifestyle because it's designed around them, not their old working lives. And to keep things simple, all the figures that we're talking about are in today's money. And with that new target, the money now lasted to the mid 80s. They now had a better life, more designed for how they would really live. And it was a huge improvement, but we weren't done yet. Our next conversation is about what retirement really looks like, not just in the first few exciting years, but as the years start to unfold. And I brought up something I've seen time and time again with clients. Our spending naturally tends to decrease as we enter our later years. We take fewer long-term holidays, and life just gets a little bit simpler as our energy and our health starts to decline. Sarah immediately agreed, and she told me about her own parents, how they used to go traveling everywhere together, and then once they hit 75, they're happy just pottering in the garden and playing with the grandkids, and they certainly weren't just flying off to Spain anymore. And together, we agreed to factor in a drop of 20% in their spending from the mid 70 onwards, bringing it down to around £32,000 a year. And when we plugged that adjustment into the plan, it showed that their money would now not run out until they were deep into their 90s. They were absolutely thrilled, obviously. We'd gone from a plan that failed in their 70s to one that saw them almost right through their lives if they lived right up to the ripe old age of 100, all while building a better lifestyle and just by getting intentional with their budget. But at this stage, what we'd done was based on linear assumptions, that future investment returns and inflation will just move in a smooth straight line when in reality, they're always unknown and volatile. When you're planning up to retirement, that kind of straight line modeling is usually enough. It helps you track the direction of travel while you're building your pot. And over long periods, average returns do tend to smooth out. But once you move into retirement and start drawing income, the average return becomes less important than the order in which those returns happen. And this is what we call sequencing risk, and it can make a big difference. Let me show you what I mean with an example. And here are two investors, the same starting amount, the same average return over the period, but in one case, the bad years happen early, and in the other, the bad years happen later. When there are no withdrawals, they end up in exactly the same place. But once you introduce income, even just £20,000 a year, the order of returns suddenly matters. The person who gets poor returns early finishes with significantly less, despite having the same average return. And that is sequencing risk in action. And this is exactly what they're worried about. What happens if returns are poor or inflation is high right at the start? And that's why we then use more robust modeling to stress test the plan. And I don't normally show clients this level of detail, but it's useful to understand what's going on behind the scenes. Instead of using smooth average returns, we stress tested the plan using over 110 years of real world historical data for investment returns and inflation. And we ran their plan through the 828 different scenarios of their retirement starting in every single month from January 1915 with their assets and their spending plans and lasting for the next 40 years, which is the retirement length we're planning for David and Sarah. With their spending pattern only ever increasing by the actual historical inflation rate, the plan was successful 85% of the time. But when I first showed them that figure, it didn't actually fill them with complete confidence. So we looked at what those numbers really meant. The worst case scenario in that entire data set showed the money running out in the late 60s. But this scenario was based on retiring in 1915 during the First World War, with the huge economic downturn that followed, draining the country's resources. And on the other hand, the best case scenario saw them die with millions of pounds. That just shows how variable the future is. It can include wars, pandemics, hyperinflation, and well, you name it. The reality is that we don't know what's going to happen until it happens. And David and Sarah could just keep working and not retire, or they could just accept that the future is uncertain and focus on what they can control in the here and now. That's where we talked about options, because historically, the worst outcomes are normally because of problems early on. So we would identify them quickly in our regular meetings and look at what to do. And as a decent amount of their spending is discretionary, they could just maybe look at spending a little bit less for a while. You see, in the real world, a plan isn't a one and done document. And to really understand what these percentages mean, Have a look at this next chart. It shows two things side by side: the chance of still being alive at different ages and the risk of running out of money by those ages. Now, obviously, as the years go by, the probability of being alive drops and the probability of the plan failing will rise, simply because you've had more years of spending. But here's the key point: for one of those failure scenarios to actually matter to you, a few things have to all happen at the same time. You would need a genuinely nasty run of returns or inflation. You would need to make no adjustments at all. And you'd also need to still be alive at the age where the plan finally breaks. When you combine the risk of running out of money with the likelihood of actually being alive to experience it, the real world risk is much lower. And in this case, it always stays below 8%. So back to the original question: can you really retire at 60 with £500,000? Well, for a couple like David and Sarah, who own their own home, have no debt, and most importantly, now have a clear and flexible plan, the answer is a confident yes. But that confidence doesn't come from a £500,000 figure on a statement. It comes from the journey that we've just walked through. It comes from facing the scary initial projection, getting intentional about your spending, and building a plan with real world contingencies. And yes, we did also talk about long term care because it's part of grown up retirement planning. In reality, this is often ultimately funded from equity in people's homes if there are no other assets remaining. So we discussed what that might look like for them if it ever became necessary. As David's health scare taught them, there's the financial risk of running out of money, but there's a bigger risk of running out of time. A good plan gives you the confidence to balance both. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful, can you do me a favor, hit the like button. It really helps other people find it. And if you want more clear, practical retirement planning like this, subscribe to my channel and I'll see you next time.